Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that is hopefully for somebody. This is episode 92 as we slowly approach 100 episodes, and I'm very happy that this week's episode marks the return of Sean O'Connell from Cinemablend. Sean, thank you. You're back.
Hey man, congratulations on almost getting to 100. That's impressive.
It lines up kind of perfectly. It'll the 100th episode will debut on, I have this written down, on July 29th, which will be a review of Deadpool and Wolverine. So
Perfect.
perfect. I
Perfect.
like the way it lined up is awesome. I didn't plan it that way, but I'm glad that I have.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think before we get into why you're here, Sean, today, which is to discuss your latest novel, 3 books in. It's baffling to me that you've written 3 of these. But last appearance on the podcast was we discussed Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse.
Okay.
And so we follow each other on Twitter, but I hadn't seen this. Do you want to get it off your chest that are you as mad as I am it didn't win a best animated feature at the Oscars?
I mean, yes, but I understand there were two factors sort of going against it. One is Miyazaki and potentially his last film ever. So maybe some of the voters in the animation block felt like they wanted to recognize him for that. Also, second of potentially 3 films, maybe a few of the voters wanted to wait until Beyond the Spider-Verse. I think that that's bogus. I think if the movie is great, reward the great movie. And I liked Across the Spider-Verse more than I liked the final Miyazaki. So, but that's the Oscars, and you brace for disappointment. And I'll circle the wagons for Beyond the Spider-Verse.
Yes, I've read the book, which we're going to get into very shortly. I was similar mindset to you, which was once there was rumblings that Miyazaki was done or potentially retiring, I went, "Oh no." Like that's the way that the system usually works. That meant it wasn't going to be the case for Across the Spider-Verse. But we've talked about your Spider-Man novel, which I have here with great power.
Thank you very much.
I wasn't doing film realist then, but here's also Release the Snyder Cut.
Oh,
And
nice.
unfortunately,
Thank you.
I live in Canada and customs hates me. So I know it's on the way. I just don't have it yet here to show in front of the cameras.
Here we go.
Perfect. There you go.
Bruce Willis, the
Yes.
man, the myth.
Yes, very much so. I have to say that I'm glad you continued the long titles of your novels. So Bruce Willis celebrating the cinematic legacy of an unbreakable Hollywood icon.
Yes, but what I did change though is so I had released the Snyder Cut, which I guess is a popular phrase for people who follow that movement. And then with great power, which, I think if you're a Spider-Man fan, you know the significance of with great power. But for this one out, I was like, I'm not going to get cute, not going to get too fancy. It's just Bruce Willis. So if you're walking past it in a bookstore and you look over and you're like, what is this one? Hey, that's a book about Bruce Willis. I'm going to just grab that. So
Yes, it perfectly fits in with that. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today is so your work as a nonfiction author. I've found it to be an interesting evolution because your first book with Release the Snyder Cut was an analysis of the production hell that kind of led to the dysfunction of the DCEU, and
mhm,
then Great Power focused on the history of a particular character, and
mhm.
then with your third book, it's a biography on a particular actor's career. So I was
Mhm.
curious, what led to the decision to like was that evolution something you thought of consciously? And then secondly, what led to it being Bruce Willis?
Yeah, those are great questions. To answer the first one, no, it's not something I thought of consciously. But when I got to the third book, or when I kind of realized I was even going to do a third book, because that was not part of any sort of blueprint or plan, I thoroughly enjoyed working on the first two, and I wanted to stay busy and have a project. Um, but with the Bruce Willis book, I was hoping to find a subject that wasn't so interview reliant. Release the Snyder Cut and with great power were both in my mind for them to be successful, I needed to secure certain interviews. I needed to get Zach for the Snyder Cut book, or else it just wouldn't feel like an official retelling. It wouldn't really have his blessing. With the Spider-Man one, there were certain executives over the character's history who shaped the decisions of the different franchises, and if I didn't get them, then I would feel incomplete. With Bruce, I always knew I was never going to get him to sit down, especially because the project really went into full swing after he announced his retirement, and I knew with the announcement of his health, with his diagnosis, that he would be even more protective than he was before, and he was notoriously, press shy, or not into doing press prior to this. So I was like, okay, well, how can I write about Bruce? And as to answer as to why, I've always been a huge fan of his work. I mean, Die Hard to me is my go-to answer for what one of my favorite movies of all time, if not my favorite movie of all time, is. I loved him on Moonlighting. I loved him in that early career, and I've been extremely impressed by the choices he made over the course of his career. So I was actually circling him as an idea of what to write about before the retirement announcement came. But once he announced his retirement, I had like two or three other book projects in mind of like directions I could go in. And I was like, I'm just going to shuttle them to the side. I'm going to focus on Bruce. And now that I'm focusing on him, how can I approach his career in a way that makes sense, for me to cover without having to rely on interviews? And to me, it was, I'm going to do as much analysis as I can. I'm going to really dive into his career. I'm going to make use of my skills as a film critic, something I've been doing for, over 20 something years. And I'm going to try to analyze why his career matters, why it's different, why it stands out from his counterparts in the 80s and 90s. And as I spent time looking at his career, and spent time thinking about the films that he made and the choices that he made, I started to see what I thought were some really interesting arcs in terms of his transition, ahead of where the industry was going, sometimes following where the industry was taking him. His pursuit of teaming up with who I think are some of the most interesting directors of our time. Some of the big swings that he took, that missed, some of the big swings he took that really connected, that he didn't anticipate. So there are all these, what I thought, were really fascinating stories within his overall career that would at least sustain an interesting book.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I had the opportunity to read the book ahead of time, so this was, for me, it was much easier to kind of framework what I wanted to discuss with you. And what one thing I want to just free compliment. Obviously, I'll be publishing my official review of the book closer to release date. When you're listening to this, the book is out in a week. So when you're listening to this, it's out June 11th on Amazon's everywhere. One of my favorite elements of the structure of this, because being, well, it's a film podcast, it was my major in school, is the way that you constructed the novel and having those distinct genres of Bruce Willis, to me, provided a much more thorough evaluation of his history as an actor. Where,
Mhm.
as you discussed throughout the book, something I don't think I really appreciated, which was the range that he has and his separation, as you said, from the other two founders of Planet Hollywood, was one of my favorite and light bulb moments of the read.
Without a doubt. And that's something that I didn't realize until I started digging into his filmography, was how often probably I compared him to the Schwarzeneggers and Stallones of the world, and how their careers definitely ran in parallel. But I was shocked in looking at it how often he took roles that, those guys could never have played, and how successful he was in those. And a lot of that has to do with, so people have sort of asked, what is it about Bruce that makes him stand out? And it's without a doubt his relatability. He has this sort of blue collar sensibility. He comes from the New Jersey, Philadelphia area, and he as big as he got, he tried to hold on to that as much as he could with the choices that he made. A lot of that's associated with the fact that he's, linked to the John McClane personality from Die Hard. Obviously, that helps a lot. I think Stallone is even always going to be compared to Rocky, but then also kind of Rambo, which put him in a larger than life action hero part. Um, Bruce could have easily just done the action movie genre his entire career, but it seemed like For a little while, he wanted to get back to comedy, whenever he got a chance to, and that led to movies like Death Becomes Her or The Whole Nine Yards. He definitely leaned into his bankability, which led to him doing Last Boy Scout or getting something as massive as Armageddon, because filmmakers knew that if they cast him, they would get an opening weekend from him. But then what I was really impressed with, and it starts with Pulp Fiction, I guess, but Bruce sort of leaned into this quiet, stoic, stage of his career, and that allowed him to carry movies like The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable. M. Night Shyamalan got a lot out of that from Bruce Willis. It led to 12 Monkeys, where he was never afraid to sort of let his co-stars shine. Brad Pitt obviously gets the Oscar nomination for 12 Monkeys. Bruce Willis isn't even recognized. Same thing with Sixth Sense. Like Toni Collette and Haley Joel Osment get recognized, but like they're acting with Bruce in that movie. How does he not get recognized? I was not able to decipher fully why the Academy just would not warm up to him as a performer, because he batted 0 in nominations, and I think that's a crime because he deserved to be recognized for a number of roles that he was in.
Well, I mean, it's a perfect pivot to in reading through, knowing he was never nominated. What has become more abundantly clear to me in my film school of just entering the theater every single weekend, and then up to a point really cared about the Academy Awards, is often, at least more recently, it feels like the Academy doesn't really appreciate subtlety like they used to. And I think that's an element of Bruce's performances that really does go often overlooked. And a part of the book I enjoyed the most was there are films I'd seen of Bruce's, but going through this as I did, it gave me an excuse to rewatch some of the movies. And 12 Monkeys is a film I'd seen once. There are a couple in this that I didn't need to rewatch. Those are the biggest films. I'm going to be totally honest. I was never going to rewatch Ocean's 12. It's easily my least favorite of that trilogy, or I guess, trilogy with a spinoff or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
There's 4 in the franchise,
yeah.
soon to be a
With more to
prequel
come.
with more to, of course.
Yeah.
But Pulp Fiction was a film I'd seen in high school when my friends were all talking about it. And in revisiting that, I really saw your point of view in analyzing that film, where what I found Bruce does so well, and you bring this up in the book, is yes, that blue collar nature is kind of an element of his characters he brings all the way through.
Mhm.
I would, his biggest successes, he manages to not just be John McClane. I mean, he did that later on for near the end of his career, but
Mhm.
for Pulp Fiction, Looper, 16 Blocks is a film I had never seen. So getting a
Right.
chance to rewatch that for the first time was quite enjoyable. How did Bruce manage to do that when so many actors fall into that trap of just being that character in other things, do you think?
Well, he's definitely guilty of taking a few roles that were clearly, Die Hard inspired. He still has Mercury Rising, or Hostage. It's because he's so prolific that you can point at both sides. You can be like, oh yeah, he definitely took the paycheck gig here. But here he was pushing himself, or using his clout to help a small time filmmaker get a picture made because maybe he believed in the script. I think that Bruce's longevity allowed him to try a lot of different things. I also think, and I've thought about this a lot more since the book is out, that the early success he had, especially with Moonlighting, but then specifically with Die Hard, gave him a financial stability that a little bit allowed him to play fast and loose with whatever he took after that point on, right? Like there's so many actors who are struggling, for the get-go until they finally break. And I use the word struggling. Most of them are overpaid, but like he had such phenomenal success with the Die Hard franchise that he could afford to try a Billy Bathgate, because it allowed him to get a couple of scenes with Dustin Hoffman. Or some of the projects he took on genuinely on paper seemed like they were good ideas. Like Bonfire of the Vanities is a Brian De Palma movie that was an adaptation of one of the most famous books at the time. You know, Tom Wolfe's novel. You have Tom Hanks, you have Melanie Griffith, you have Brian De Palma in the director's chair. Like when Bruce signs on the line for that one, it seems like it's a good idea.
Hmm.
So, but what was also really impressive about him as well too, and it sort of speaks to what you were mentioning about him trying him being able to try different things, even when he had a bomb or a string of bombs in a row, and that early period where it was like Hudson Hawk and Mortal Thoughts, and which is a movie he took because he largely wanted to work with his wife, Demi Moore. It never prevented him from finding work down the line. Like no one lost interest in Bruce Willis, and he would revive himself relatively quickly with maybe another Die Hard. Die Hard with a Vengeance comes back around and makes him really, really popular again. But he would also find something like Armageddon, that was like, oh yeah, Bruce is a huge star, and when he's going to pop up in something, he's going to be amazing at it. He did chase the science fiction, realm in the '90s when all the action stars were trying to do science fiction movies, and we got things like Demolition Man for Stallone, and Arnold was doing Total Recall and Terminator and all that stuff. Bruce ends up doing The Fifth Element with Luc Besson. He does 12 Monkeys at that time. So he did chase a few of the trends, but he was always just working. He was always prolific. If you look at the course of his career, he's doing 2 movies a year, essentially, almost all the time. So he never stops working, which I also find really, really impressive.
I think we've spent enough time not talking about it, and I know for everyone you've mentioned it. Let's talk about Die Hard. Outside of the first one of the elements I loved was Die Hard has its own chapter in the book, or section, as it should. Technically, it's 3 chapters, and the way you break it down, I quite enjoyed. But you really don't like Die Hard 3, and that shocked me.
No, all right. So it's not that I don't like it. I think it's a good movie, a perfectly fine movie. It just bothers me that it's a Die Hard movie. Like it doesn't stick to the unofficial rules, the unstated rules of a Die Hard film. It's the first one in the franchise that starts to expand what we expect out of a Die Hard movie. And I don't like that. I prefer John McClane, to be fighting for a family who loves him. Like starting with a vengeance, his family hates him. Like the defining characteristics of Holly's left him in With a Vengeance. His daughter hates him in Live Free or Die Hard, and his son can't stand him in A Good Day to Die Hard. Like all of a sudden, John McClane is his family, and I hate that. I think that's terrible after the first 2 movies that have established him. And With a Vengeance was never written as a Die Hard movie. It was written as first a spec treatment called Simon Says, which was going to have just a police officer running around New York City trying to decode these riddles by some guy named Simon. Then it was pitched as a potential Lethal Weapon sequel, which then makes sense when you see the Samuel Jackson inclusion of it, that maybe that could have been Riggs and Murtaugh
Hmm.
on a mission. And then they retrofit it to become a Die Hard movie. So I don't know. Like I said, it's a fine movie. I don't see John McClane in that movie necessarily. I see this disgruntled, bitter alcoholic who, sure, you can make an argument that might be where the character evolved to, but I don't like that version of the character. I like the noble doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, as opposed to someone who's being sort of forced into his heroic deeds by a manipulative criminal. So
That's fair. I mean, I disagree, but that's fair. So, given that, I mean, I know this, but I would like to put it on the podcast record
sure.
from worst to best. I mean, we know what number one is, but so from worst to best, how would you rank Die Hards? So 5 to 1.
Oh, I mean, I think that they legitimately go in release order.
Okay.
I like one the best. I like two more than three. I like three more than four, and five, in my opinion, shouldn't count.
That so I have a funny anecdote to talk about that real briefly. I think you'll appreciate this. I had when was that? 2013? Is that when that came out? A Good Day to Die Hard?
Could be. That sounds right.
I feel like that's right. I should look that up because somebody's going to say I got it wrong. It was 2013. So it was the first Valentine's day. I mean, it's that whole thing is overrated in general. But
That's right. Yes.
regardless, it was the first Valentine's Day. No, I lied. I'm editing my own history in my life wrong. So it was the second Valentine's Day that my wife, then girlfriend, we were supposed to be together, but she had a work thing and was in Boston. And I'm
Okay.
like, okay, what am I going to do? It's Valentine's Day weekend. I know, I'll go see A Good Day to Die Hard. Why
Okay.
not? And I walk into that theater, and I have never seen a sadder theater full of men in my entire life. Before the movie started, because we all knew
Right.
why
Right.
we were there. We were all
Right.
alone. We had nothing else to do. And then people were probably more sad leaving the theater after that.
Yeah. It's hard not to be. I mean, it couldn't have been more disappointing. And I mean, you talk about an actor who had just lost the plot of who the character was and what made that character special. One of the things that really breaks my heart about Bruce's retirement is that we'd always kind of heard this rumor of a final Die Hard, kind of around the time that Hugh Jackman did Logan, and a few other of the aging franchises. I'm blanking on examples of them. Were coming up with ways to bring some closure to them after a long period of time, and I think the most prevalent one was like a Die Hard Year One story, where it would be young John McClane, working on a case that somehow connected to whatever case was involving Bruce Willis at the time that he is. It was never meant to be, and I would have loved for him to, because instead what we get, and I write about it in the book, is that Die Hard battery commercial that we got, which was just atrocious. So
It
like
certainly was.
somehow more of an insult to the legacy of the character than even A Good Day to Die Hard was.
Yeah, my personal ranking is Die Hard 1. And
Okay.
this isn't preferences. I love Live Free or Die Hard, the fourth one.
It,
I think the
it's really
foil with
good.
Justin Long works
Yeah.
really well. So that would
Yeah.
be 2. 3 would be Die Hard. My brain just wants to call it Die Hard 2, but I know Die Harder is technically also in the title. And
Sure.
then 4 would be Die Hard with a Vengeance. And then it's
Okay.
a chasm of film of nothing. And then A Good Day to Die Hard.
I like you picking Live Free. That's good. That's good. It's it gets crapped on a little bit. But for what Len Wiseman had to do, that was a tough gig to bring that franchise back after such a long period of time. And the action sequences are really good in it. That sequence in the elevator shaft is great. I go back and rewatch that often. It's staged really well. It's choreographed great. So yeah, it's got some really good memorable scenes in it.
I think its biggest mistake, and a lot of action around this era had this problem, which was they were R-rated franchises that somehow still appealed to kids in the 80s. But
Yeah,
as I think film families got stricter and they actually started caring about ratings, the uncut version of the film is the one I prefer. It's the one with the cursing, where
yeah.
the gunshot doesn't cover over his catchphrase, which I won't say because then I'll have to bleep it out later, and I'm going to save myself the editing time. But I really liked. I think just based on age, it would have been the first one I saw in theaters, but in with
Okay.
re-releases, I've now seen them all in theaters, which is great. So we talked about. I mean, we don't need to get into if Die Hard is a Christmas movie. It is. You talk about it in the book, and even though Bruce said it wasn't in his roast, we're going to ignore that. But I'm curious, with your long going film career, was Die Hard the first thing you saw him in theaters?
No, I saw Blind Date
Okay,
before that because I was a big Moonlighting fan. Moonlighting is a show that I got to watch with my parents when it was on. It was kind of like must see TV. Um, and strange as it is to say, when I was like probably 12, somewhere around there. So that came out in 88. I was born in 74. So I was about 13, 14, somewhere around there. I can distinctly remember the narrative around the will they or won't they, for Maddie and David, and having to sort of watch. But even at that time, like I was reading a ton of detective novels. That's one of my preferred genres. So to get a detective show that had that sort of bounce and wit to it, I was always into comedies, and so seeing something that funny, seeing this guy who was just a firecracker on air. I loved getting a chance to see that on a weekly basis. So then Blind Date comes out. He kind of plays a straight man in that. You know, he's there to kind of set up Larroquette and Kim Basinger, but you could at least see that, like, okay, this is the start of someone taking off in his career. And then Die Hard was my first R-rated movie. I had to convince my mom to buy a ticket for me. And she let me go in by myself, and her sister walked around the mall where the theater was located, and they shopped while I sat there and watched it. And it changed my life. I mean, it legitimately, it's not an exaggeration to say that, like, after that screening, I thought about movies differently, you know, and became obsessed with them. So, you know, by extension of that, I became obsessed with Bruce kind of, and then just followed his career from that point on. I mean, tried to see almost everything that he was in a theater. Missed a few of them, you know, especially during like college and stuff like that when I was busy with stuff. But I remember going. I know exactly where I saw Pulp Fiction, um, and I also have a very distinct memory of seeing The Sixth Sense on a Friday night opening weekend, and feeling the palpable change, you know, the current in the air when the twist hits. That will rank as one of my all-time unforgettable movie theater memories.
My experience was similar just based on age. I was born in 91. And so the real first time at least I noticed Bruce was as Elizabeth's dad in Friends, because that was
Okay.
either 99 or the 2000s after A Whole Nine Yards. And
Mhm.
when, like, obviously he's hilarious in that, doing his dance in front of the mirror and everything. And then later on seeing Die Hard. So it was
Yeah.
a similar transition, but just further into his career and then following his other films after that. Now, I don't want to spoil your Mount Rushmore. And I have to say, as somebody who's in all over film Twitter, we have conversations all the time. The way through the book, as it feels like a conversation, just kind of broken into pieces, I have to commend you because it was so easy to read,
Oh, thank you.
as opposed to somebody just saying, so Bruce Willis was born in whatever time and like
Oh.
having the breakup with the genre. It was really easy. And as somebody who struggles with reading sometimes, thank you so much for that.
Well, I legitimately wanted people to be able to bounce around the book if they wanted to. You know, I fully anticipate people will pick up the book and jump right to whatever chapter they're more interested in. And there's probably a bunch of films that maybe you haven't seen yet. So I wanted to, when you get to a new chapter, I want to start a new conversation, you know, and I want the conversation to be about that film. And I'll try in that chapter to explain where we are in the course of not just his career but the industry as a whole, and maybe like, this is why this film mattered, this is kind of where we were at, this is where the industry is going. If you want to go through the section and just do all of his comedies in a row, great, but I would love for people to stop, you know, repeatedly and watch the movies that I'm talking about in here, you know. And then, as you said, like, you watch Pulp Fiction, you had a different appreciation of it because maybe something that I wrote. Like, that's completely the point of the book. I would love it to be a guide that's sort of, you know, a companion piece to all of his films.
Yeah, I think it really does work like that. So I wanted to share with you or not my Die Hard Mount Rushmore. We did that already. My Bruce Willis Mount Rushmore, which is
All
Die
right,
Hard is
I'm
on
ready.
there. Die Hard, obviously, as probably on my Mount Rushmore of action films ever. And it feels dismissive to just call it that because it's it's so much more than just that, which is why all of the copycat versions, and you bring up the Die Hard on a bus, Die Hard on a train, and that made me
Yeah.
laugh out loud. Pulp Fiction, which I don't think I would have had on the list until revisiting it the past couple weeks. It's
Okay.
probably my favorite Bruce performance. It just in terms of like screen time to impact was so much more than I remembered.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
And
His
then
stretch from when he's about to leave the shop to then going through all the different weapons, like, might be one of my favorite stretches of acting in his entire career, because it's wordless, you know, but it's just the escalation of the different weapons that he's picking up is morbidly hilarious.
oh yeah, the pacing of that is so funny. Yeah. So it's Die Hard, Pulp
Yep.
Fiction, and then
Okay.
for serious science fiction, I remember seeing this in theaters and being like, "Oh my god, this is exactly what I like out of sci-fi." It's a Looper. I love the
Yeah,
back and forth. That diner sequence is absolutely incredible.
great.
And
Yeah,
I would
so great.
argue it's like the last time Bruce maybe cared. Maybe. I
I
don't
think
know.
that's his last great movie. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's sad because of how many movies come after it. And, I don't fully blame the diagnosis. I think that he was wrestling with some stuff, but I also would have loved somebody from his team to step in and sort of say, you don't have to be doing these, like how much is too much?
Hmm.
And there's an argument that I've heard that maybe he just liked working. There's nothing wrong with him if he just wanted to keep being on a set, for a couple of days. But like it's a long period of time after Looper that he continued to work. And I'm with you. I think Looper's probably the last great thing he was part of.
And then to round out my Mount Rushmore, so Die Hard, Pulp Fiction, Looper. In terms of just bombastic fun, it's Armageddon. It is
Okay.
maybe the dumbest movie he did, but still manages to ride that razor's edge of entertaining, even though you know how stupid it is. And as
Yeah.
you point out in the book, the Criterion commentary by Ben Affleck is incredible. It's so funny, and
Yeah.
it's probably funnier than the movie, which I highly recommend if you have a chance to check that out. You absolutely should. So, Sean, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast.
Oh, dude, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, as stated at the beginning, but if you missed that, that's okay. Bruce Willis celebrating the cinematic legacy of an unbreakable, see, I see what you did there, Hollywood icon is available on June 11th. I know we talked about it prior to its official announcement that it's the perfect Father's Day present. And so, if you're looking for a last minute one of those, you can do that. Thanks again to Sean for joining us. On to listener mail. This week's question was, what franchise do you think deserves a prequel? Thank you to everybody for writing in. Let's get to your responses. First comes in from Dylan Pollock, which says, does any franchise need a prequel? I really don't think so, but I'm going to randomly go with Evil Dead, and then I'd love to see who the Deadites messed with before Ash. That's cool. I know a lot of people enjoyed the exploration of that franchise. Personally, I think the hardest thing would be, Dylan, would be to who do you cast as Ash? That's my question for you. Next, Brian Manili from Jump on the Batwagon wrote in The Land Before Time, because it would be cool to know what the land looked like before time. That's very funny, Brian. Thanks so much for writing that in. Jermaine Jones, Kill Bill, The Adventures of the Deadly Viper Assassins. That is really true. It's very interesting that there are franchises that I think a lot of people would want Quentin Tarantino to explore some more, but after the cancellation of his Critic film, I don't know. There's been rumors that we were going to get a Kill Bill 3. I'm curious about that. Stephanie wrote in on the Spotify app, Harry Potter, particularly how the Marauders became friends and made the map. And how in the heck did Peter Pettigrew, a lump of a boy, become part of that group? He was not cool enough. That's true. And then Stephanie and Mike wrote in a separate email. Hi, I know I've already answered on Spotify, but after rewatching Snowpiercer for the past few weeks, we think that would be a great prequel as well. It would be cool to see what the political and geographical landscape of the world was before the freeze. All decisions that led scientists to deploying CW7 to cool the atmosphere, etc. Hopefully season 4 will give us some of the answers we're looking for, but a prequel would be cool to see how the world froze over. Looking forward to listening to the episode, Steph and Mike. Thanks so much for everybody who wrote in. There's been a lot of great prequels. There haven't been many recently, but it's interesting because before Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the modern trilogy did kind of work as a prequel leading up to, with just adding some more practical science as opposed to the very high or significant sci-fi elements of the modern of the Planet of the Apes franchise. Personally, I would love to see a pre-Mask of Zorro, so a younger Don De La Vega would be really cool to me, and you could cast probably an actual Hispanic or Mexican actor to play that role. That would be the thing that I'm looking forward to, but unfortunately it's very rare for us to get good swashbuckling movies now and then. Thank you so much for listening to the Film Realist podcast. Next week's episode will be 2 reviews, one of Hitman and Bad Boys Ride or Die. But before we end the episode, next week's question is, what is your favorite Bruce Willis film? I know I talked to Sean about my Mount Rushmore, but I would like to know what yours is. So please write in by answering in the Spotify app, commenting directly below on the social media platforms, or you can email the podcast directly. That's filmreelistspod@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you next time.